So in this section, let's talk about buttons in our UI. And before we do that, let's just briefly talk about what's going on in the larger Flutter ecosystem. iOS and Android are fully supported in Flutter, and that was the first step. But there is so much more in the pipeline. And one of the areas that is working its way up to production and is very close at this point is Flutter's support for the web. So that is on the beta channel. If you are running on the beta channel, you can run a Flutter web app. A lot of people are using Flutter Web in production now, although it's not fully recommended by Google at this point. But it seems like it's very close. And that has necessitated some changes to the Flutter widgets. And one of the biggest areas where that has needed to happen was buttons, because buttons behave so much differently on the web than they do in a Android or iOS mobile application. When you hover over them or click on them, they change colors, they shift around. We just have a different expectation for how buttons behave. And so the reason I'm telling you this is that if you look in the widget catalog, and you go to the basics, there is, I believe, one button in here. Yeah, the raise button is here. But the full set of buttons for the material scaffold and the material library, which we are using, is in the material components. And there is actually a buttons section. And all of these buttons here are actually actively being phased out. Or not all of them, but the flat button, the raised button, and the outline button are being phased out. And I know this because when you click on flat button, it's going to tell you this class is obsolete. Please use text button instead. And it does have a link to the new button from there. So I am going to show you the new buttons because I think they're going to become the standard relatively shortly. However, you should be aware of raised button, outline button, flat button, because they are still in the widget catalog and you may still come across them in other people's Flutter's applications or in tutorials that you may do online. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, the older buttons are actually a little bit simpler to use than the newer buttons because of all the options that need to be included in the web. So if you do need to roll back to the older ones, it should be a fairly simple jump. So we'll cover the new ones. Now, the new ones are much better themed with colors and styles using a centralized theme. And I don't want to cover that until later in the course. So I'm going to show you just the basics of the new buttons. And when it comes to adding themes and colors and styles, we'll circle back around to that at a later date. I think trying to cover that in this section would get a little bit complicated. All right, with that ominous and scary introduction, let's go ahead and get started adding a couple buttons here, which is really not going to be a big deal. All right, so we've got our text widget here, and what I'd like to do is actually get rid of the text and the container and just start fresh. So I'm going to highlight the container here. I'm going to see where it ends, and I'm just going to take it out. All right, so for my body, I am going to do the first of the new buttons, which is an elevated button. And when we type in the elevated button, we're going to get a yellow underscore or squiggly here on our widget. And this is going to tell us, if we scroll down, that the parameter onPressed is required and the parameter child is required. So this is the first time we've encountered this where a widget says it needs you to actually fill out certain properties before it is willing to display it on the screen. So let's satisfy those requirements. So the first is a child, and that's going to be a text widget in our case. So we'll just do a text widget that says press me. And the second thing you need is an Onpress method. So this is a function that's going to happen when somebody presses that button. Now, we're going to cover all of that in a later section. So for now, we're going to leave it blank by doing an open and close parentheses and an open and close curly braces and putting nothing in them. So we've just met the basic requirements, and we can see now that we have a button right here on the screen. It's got a nice little splash animation when we press it. And it is blue because that is the central theme that we have set up here for our primary swatch. When we circle back around and expand on styling, we'll set up other themes for the buttons so that we can have things like a primary button and an accent button that have different colors. But for now, we'll leave that as good for an elevated button. Now, two other button types I want to show you, and all we have to do is just change the name of the widget. So we have an outlined button. Now that is replacing outline button. So it's just a little confusing, but outline button is the new one. And if we were to save that, we see we have a faint outline here with a primary color, press me right here. And lastly, flat button. Nope, sorry, text button. Flat button is the one that's being raised. I'm having a hard time with it. Flat button is being phased out, and text button is going to be the new one. And you can see that also has that nice little animation on it as well. So that's a basic introduction to buttons. The old ones did have more properties with colors that you could easily configure. The newer ones are more awkward to configure individually, but you know, you really shouldn't be doing that anyway. So when we visit theming and styling, we'll set up nice button themes and styles that we can call on in our UI. So next we're going to take a look at adding an image to our app.